The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Megan Raymond with WCET. Thank you so much for joining us for our first webcast in 2016, Issues and Trends in Edtech. If you have any questions or comments, or if you would like to add your own predictions, please enter them into the chat box. Our moderator and myself will be monitoring that chat box and fielding the questions to the speakers. We are recording this presentation and we'll make the link to the archive available to you next week. And feel free to follow the Twitter feed at WCET Webcast. Again, as we go along and you have questions or comments, please enter them into the chat box. We'll get to those at the Q&A section after the presentations. The flow of the webcast today will do brief speaker introductions. Jeff, Tanya, and Mark will share their forecasts and insights. We'll have a lively moderated discussion, then invite the audience to provide their own questions and predictions, and then we will conclude. First, I'd like to do a quick poll, see where you're at with what you're foreseeing as to be a top issue or trend at your institution. Well, it looks like it's hotly contested between CBE and adaptive learning. Oh, this is pretty exciting. 54% have voted, so go ahead and enter in your vote. Quickly coming in, this is pretty interesting. Those of you that selected other, go ahead and enter that into the chat box, just out of curiosity, what you see as the other issue. Okay, 72%. We'll give it just another few seconds here. Very interesting. Okay, we're at 75%, so I'm going to go ahead and close it so we can move on. But interesting results. So 44% of you said adaptive learning, 37% CBE, 4% virtual reality, 10% other, and 5% IoT. Again, if you selected other, go ahead and enter that into the chat box. Our moderator today is Nick White, and Nick White is our steering committee chair here at WCET. He's also the director of competency-based learning solutions at Capella University, so I think he was jockeying for more CBE votes. His constant goal is to find ways to make learning more effective and efficient for adult learners through innovative design practices and the smart use of technology. So I'd like to go ahead and pass it over to Nick, who will then introduce our panelists. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you so much, Megan. I was definitely expecting CBE to come out on top. I'm very surprised. Even though we have adaptive learning pilots, I just expected, based on the data I've seen through Public Agenda, that CBE would be the most prevalent trend right now. But that's why we do these polls. So I have the pleasure of introducing our esteemed panel. I think you'll enjoy what they have to say. They have a very diverse set of viewpoints and perspectives from their professional experience. They have breadth and depth, and these people are both veterans and visionaries. So I'll go through some of their background, and I think you'll hear all of that. Dr. Jeff Borden is the Chief Innovation Officer at St. Leo University. For 2 decades, Jeff has focused on trying to transform higher education. From 2002 to 2014, Jeff worked as a vice president with eCollege, which was acquired by Pearson Education, providing an academic vision and strategy that encompassed digital learning, neo-millennial instruction methods, authentic assessment, and beyond. In 2013, as Research and Innovation Network's Center for E-Learning Director, Jeff pursued rigorous research opportunities through a think tank of educational innovation. For 20 years, Dr. Borden has consulted with educators in every U.S. state led transformative efforts in 34 countries, provided almost 200 keynote presentations to audiences of 100 to 10,000, and spoken with stakeholders from teachers to principals to college administrators to government officials. Prior to his private sector work, Jeff taught full-time at the University of Northern Colorado, Front Range Community College, and was the coordinator of public speaking at Metropolitan State College of Denver. At the same time, in 20 years, Dr. Borden has continued teaching communication, rhetoric, and education classes at various levels, from technical schools to community colleges to state and private universities. Dr. Tanya Justin. Our next panelist is the Director of Digital Learning Research and Development and of the National Research Center for Distance Education and Technological Advancements, supported by the U.S. Department of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Dr. Justin works to guide strategic digital learning efforts at the campus, state, and national levels to develop innovative programming for the UWM campus and leads a team of researchers to advance the field. She is an Online Learning Consortium Fellow recognized for her creative work in blended and online learning, and as a leader, teacher, researcher, and author. Dr. Justin currently leads a national multi-institutional research effort to identify key factors in distance education that influence student success. She has previously led efforts in blended and online faculty development program and faculty engagement initiatives for blended and online teaching. She also oversaw administration of the campus LMS and other technologies, including training and support. Moreover, her efforts have been highlighted in many national news and media outlets, including the Chronicle of Higher Education, Forbes, and others. Dr. Justin is involved in influencing the future of education, including the UWM campus and digital futures planning, University of Wisconsin System Learn at UW Executive Committee Roadmap Planning, NMC Horizon Project Higher Ed Advisory Board, EDUCAUSE Evolving Technology Steering Committee, and EDUCAUSE IT Status Committee. And finally, our third panelist, Mark Luba, is Vice President of Product Management for IMS Global, the Edtech Interoperability Leader. As a technology executive in education, Mark has held positions as CIO for an online university, CTO for an LMS platform company, and consulting advisor to leading foundations in education. In 2015, Mark led TIP, the Technical Interoperability Pilot Project for the Competency-Based Education Network, and published the project research in the EDUCAUSE Review. So I think from what you just heard, you can hear the background of this panel stretches across academia, research, applied innovation, working in foundations, working in the private sector, working in technology. So we couldn't be happier to have these three. And with all of the activity these days in the EdTech arena, the venture capital money flowing in, the work around adaptive and analytics and CBE products, it's a great time to have this conversation. So with that, our first panelist is Dr. Jeff Borden, and he'll have a few slides and give a little bit of his vision, and then we'll move on to the other two and open it up for questions. So go ahead, Jeff.
Thanks so much, Nick. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the time that you've all taken to look at this. I've actually been doing this for a number of years, trying to trend spot over time, and I think I've got a fairly decent record. So I thought I should go back and look at last year at what I said about trends and issues for this exact webcast last year. And I mentioned four things in the midst of higher education really taking a moment to reset. I think that a lot of people were at a place where they'd seen some really good initiatives that hadn't worked for various reasons that they needed to take another shot at, and at the same time see what they should do moving forward. And so I talked about CBE really getting a lot of press and taking off even more than it had the year before. I talked about MOOCs kind of going away, going out of so many headlines. I talked about games and gamification and gameful learning really starting to take the world by storm. And then finally, I talked about how badges, I thought, would really start to blow up, and connections with Google and LinkedIn and some other things would happen. And I don't know that I can say that I was right about badges, but I think the other three were probably pretty close. So as I look into 2016, and if you could advance to the next slide, please. In 2016, the things that I think we're going to start to see more of, there's really kind of four elements. So go ahead and go on to the next slide, Megan. Number one, e-learning is finally mature. You know, we're now past our 18th birthday, so e-learning can actually drink. But if you start to look around, people have really started to notice that what we did in the past was try to take practices, some of which were not good practices, and simply put those practices into a new medium. Even last month, WCET had a piece about adaptive learning, and if you watch the TEDx video on there, you hear about the need to move beyond no significant difference, that we really haven't leveraged the power of the internet, the power of these connection tools. We've not made e-learning courses what they could be as much as we've made them try to mirror what's happened on ground. And so with more and more connectors like MuleSoft that we're using at our institution to try to connect the different systems to create one significant ecosystem, we're starting to see more and more capability being given to e-learning. At the same time, we're looking at learning research and how that learning research applies inside of an e-learning context so that it really does use the best stuff that we know about learning, from some of the work that Carol Dweck has done to neuroscience to some other things. At St. Leo, you might notice up in the headline there, we have actually completely changed our development and delivery model to one that really engages learners worrying about motivation and some other things like that. So e-learning has grown up, and I think we're going to see more and more different kinds of courses coming out that really showcase that differentiation, that really showcase the growing up, the maturation of e-learning, so that we're having a different conversation when it comes to online learning. If you could go to the next slide. The second thing that I think has also really kind of grown up is learning analytics. You know, you see recently maybe the headline that Blue Canary was acquired by Blackboard. Civitas has certainly made a pretty big name for itself pretty quickly. And learning analytics, I think it finally got through what I'm calling its awkward phase. There were a lot of promises made over the last 10, 15, even 20 years, especially as it came to online education, but education in general. And I think there were a lot of over-promising, under-delivering providers out there. And, you know, I worked at companies that were even part of the cacophony of noise trying to convince people to move toward data-driven decisions. And while a few people kept on it the whole time, a lot of people took their eye off the ball because of those that over-promising and that under-delivering. But data has really come back to a place where people are using it meaningfully. Because more systems are connecting in a more meaningful way, I think we're starting to see the power behind some of these companies like Newton and Starfish, the analytics coming out of LMS engines. I think you're really starting to see how data is being used meaningfully to get students through courses in adaptive fashions, in more personalized fashions. It's obviously a real leverage point for CBE. So learning analytics, I think you're going to see more and more of in more meaningful ways at conferences, in headlines, in places like the Chronicle. You're going to hear more about how we're finding people in monitoring, trending, and predictive fashions than we ever have before. People are finally starting to get there. If you could go to the next slide. I think one of those elements that we've all already heard a little bit about, that Nick even mentioned, I think CBE actually goes a little bit quiet this year, and there's going to be more action than there is talking. I think there was a lot of talk in 2015 about competency-based education, what that meant, what the promises could be, and a ton of schools started working on it. 500-600 schools really began working on a CBE story, and I think this is the year when you start to see them coming out. I know there have been some struggles with accreditors. There's been struggles with the DOE, with financial aid, with any number of things, but a lot of schools have figured out some pretty clever and creative workarounds for some of those issues. And while there still will be some, I think that CBE will really take off and trend in a way that it did not in 2015 in terms of practical application. And obviously that makes me excited to see that happen, but I think we're going to see more and more of that. And then finally, the last slide that I have. I really believe you're going to see more research-driven learning inside of classrooms, be it online or not. I immediately think of neuroscience and brain science, how you can really create a cocktail, if you will, of the right neurotransmitters to try to keep people engaged and motivated and excited. We also, at the same time, know those cocktails that are very detrimental, that can bore people, that can lead to high levels of stress and angst and frustration. And while we try to avoid the cortisol kinds of experiences, we can definitely try to utilize dopamine and endorphins, and we can use norepinephrine and serotonin and some of these other neurotransmitters that we know as we get closer to a universal learning experience. A lot of research has come out saying there's no such thing as a learning style. Others say there is a learning style. I don't think that that even matters anymore because what we know about the brain gives us really in an unparalleled way as close as we likely will ever get to a universal learning experience based on things like hormones, neurotransmitters, and other things that we know about the brain. Stuff like that, stuff like Carol Dweck's work around growth mindset, those are all starting to infuse their way meaningfully into curriculum, K through 20. And I think we will only hear more and more as that comes along this year. I think that's my time. I'm anxious for the questions and answers, but I'll turn it back over to Nick to introduce the next speaker.
So you use drinking as a metaphor for learning. Is that right, Jeff?
Always.
That's an unusual choice. All right, Tanya, over to you. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Nick. I just have one slide, and I guess as a social scientist and like everyone on this panel, we're constantly just paying attention of what's going on and consuming information and sort of processing that information. And I probably process it a little bit differently. And this is probably more like a theoretical perspective on trends, but I'm always looking at sort of what are the common factors that we're seeing out of the different sorts of technologies that are there, the different instructional practices, institutional practices, and so forth. And so, you know, and looking too at, there's so many articles out already about what happened in 2015 and what happens in 2016. And there really were two important factors sort of in the current landscape of higher ed to note. And I sort of put these in more sort of structurational theory sort of perspective here. And so I think these include changes in structural principles of higher ed. And that's something normally I don't usually focus on. But I think also the second factor is sort of this increased transparency we're seeing in the black box of education. And I'll explain those in a little bit more detail. Structural properties or exhibits of rules and resources and their impact are they're going to impact or they're going to influence our conduct or our practices. And there's lots of changes going on in sort of the structure of higher ed, more than I've probably seen in a very long time. And there's three of these structural properties I wanted to point out that we're currently seeing in higher ed that I think are impacting our Edtech trends and some of the decisions that we're making. And this, I divided these up into access, time, and data. You know, when we talk about access, you know, we have, this is sort of this whole movement with higher ed, more than ever before. It's not about the weeding out of students, it's about opening up and fostering all students on their pathway to success. We're also seeing, you know, less 18-year-olds than we've ever seen before, and movement with the government to really provide access to a quality education for all of our students. So we're seeing increases in online learning, and we're seeing increases in open education resources, and I think we're going to see more of this. We're also seeing some changes in access due to financial circumstances. So we're seeing free community college coming our way. We also see the new Title IV Equip program coming our way. And so this providing access to students for education through different pathways is very interesting. We're also seeing a renewed interest in accessibility. And so this is for not only students with disability, but I think lots of underrepresented students, and how, again, do we provide them this pathway to degree. And this is just one throwing out there, you know, bring your own device has been around for a long time, and I've always just sort of downplay it, like, well, it's just hardware and everyone's got hardware. But the point is we're overcoming the digital divide. You know, years ago in my communication technology class, we talked about the digital divide as, do you have dial-up or not? And then it was, do you have broadband and better broadband? And now it's, do you have a device with 4G? And, you know, can your instruction and your institutional services happen on a device? And I think we're going to continue to see this movement of access. So at your institution, thinking about how are you providing access to students in different ways. Access to a degree, access to instruction, and access to institutional services. The second one is time, and obviously this has been going on for decades, right? But I think more than ever we're really rethinking time because of our society. So we're rethinking seat time, we're rethinking our work week and our workplace. There's a lot more virtual work happening. You know, Jeff had mentioned, and obviously Nick, the focus on competency-based education, and I think that's currently, you know, we're seeing that not only because of movement and time, but in part, you know, lots of people who are in line and going to respond best to a competency-based education are doing it in part because limitations in time. We've also seen other instructional approaches, you know, such as self-paced and youth-paced. At the end of the day, you know, people want instruction and they want service and they want it anytime, anywhere. These are services people are used to in their day-to-day life getting, whether it's from an airlines, their cell phone provider, or so forth, and they're sort of bringing that to higher ed, that they expect to, you know, have this option of anytime, anywhere. We also have this idea of data, and I sort of thought, like, do we call this data or evidence? And, you know, Jeff had sort of mentioned this idea of, you know, research-based decision-making. We hear a lot about evidence-based, research-based, data-driven. You know, I'm leading this National Research Center, and too, you hear a lot of people talk about, oh my gosh, we have so much data, we don't even know what to do with. And also Jeff had mentioned Civitas and PAR and some others that are out there. And I think we're going to see, advisory board, and there's just tons out there that are trying to aggregate the data. And I think there's been some limitations there, and I think we're going to see that really start moving forward as we have more, we have the caliper standards now, we have more ability to aggregate data from multiple sources, and I think we're going to move forward in identifying what data is meaningful to help us better understand student learning. The sort of second piece of this, which is sort of the more micro level, is sort of this black box of education that I like to call it. You know, for years we've treated education as somewhat of this black box. You know, students go in, they come out, there's some indicators of success. Jeff mentioned the no significant difference phenomena. You know, we're constantly looking at one black box of online versus one black box of face-to-face and finding out there's no, you know, significant difference when it comes to student performance or learning or student satisfaction. And really identify that the key is what's happening inside that black box. So it's not just about adding tech somewhere in the box and then comparing tech versus not tech. It's really better understanding what's happening inside that box is really becoming of utmost importance. And so there were three sorts of areas there I felt that we should pay attention to, and that's going to be the authenticism, the connectedness, and the interactivity. And this sort of came up in the front poll. You know, there's always been this movement starting in the 70s and 80s and being transformed a bit in education with social presence and the idea of richness. But I think we're seeing more evidence when we talk about students having different literacies around video and images, visual literacy, 21st century literacies. And that really comes about having this realness, you know, feeling like you're talking to other people. And I see this as, you know, Megan had in the opening poll, the idea of virtual reality, 3D printing, augmented reality. So I think there's this push with educators and with students to have this realness. I think the second one that's a real key theme here is the connectedness. So people want to belong to other people. They want to be connected. They want to be engaged. And I think, again, this is very evident with the Internet of Things and with wearables. So not only do we want to be connected to each other, we want to be connected to our stuff, which I think is really interesting. The final one being interactivity, and this is obviously being a social scientist and a scholar and teacher of communication. Tom Cavanaugh last year talked a lot about personalized learning, and we just heard Jeff talk about adaptive learning, but I think the key is that students want frequent feedback. They want to know how they're learning, they want to improve their learning, and they have an expectation for that, and I think that's this interactivity, this feedback they expect is why we're seeing this rise in personalized and adaptive learning. But we're also still seeing a rise in active learning, online pedagogy, active learning classrooms, and those other things as well. So those are just some of the top structural properties and micro level things I think are important. I'm going to turn it back over to Nick.
Thank you, Tanya. Mark, you're up, and then we'll move to the moderated discussion. Please go ahead, Mark.
Sounds good, Nick. Thank you very much. When we think about trends and issues in EdTech for 2016, the CBE is somewhat unique in that it represents a large trend, but then also a large bundle of issues. As you mentioned, the TIP project, Nick, the CBEN work that IMS did with the Competency-Based Education Network, we uncovered a whole raft of barriers to the scalability of CBE within the institutional systems landscape. So if you're online and you have access to your keyboard, I'd suggest Googling TIP and EDUCAUSE. And if you have some time, please read the report because it will inform a lot of what IMS Global is doing this year, in response to the CBE phenomenon. So we do see CBE coming into a breakout year in 2016, and as Jeff said, it will be a quiet year because the breakout is going to be represented by the vendors putting their heads down and developing features to support CBE. The predominant SIS vendors, the large enterprise vendors, have been slow, almost woefully slow to support the competency-based education movement. But that's changing. Last year there was a lot of movement in this area, and while it's still slower than it needs to be, movement is happening. So we predict within the next 12 to 18 months we're going to start to see some very fully featured product sets from the large established vendors supporting CBE in a fully integrated way. Right now you have pockets of support for CBE, most notably through the growth of the niche providers, the smaller tech companies that are innovators and doing some excellent work. But we also see the large established companies and products that many of the folks on the line today are using gradually beginning to release their CBE-ready products. And at the heart of this is the interoperability requirement. These systems all must talk together. One of the things that came out of the TIP study was that institutions have an average of 12 unique platforms that will need to be communicate. And a lot of these platforms deal in curriculums and deal in student records, deal in things that are going to require support for CBE. So the key areas that IMS Global is focusing on in the upcoming year are CBE assessment outcomes, number one. Secondly, the digital credentials, especially and including digital transcripts. And thirdly, the caliper learning analytics, a continued expansion of that, as Jeff and Tanya both referenced, but moving from a platform-bound set of analytics, which is a period that hopefully we're moving away from, into an enterprise analytics capability through, again, standards-based learner analytics. Next slide, please. Thinking about two challenges in particular for the competency-based ed. First is in the area of managing the curriculum. Historically, large systems are managing the courses in an online catalog of some kind, an integrated database, and the competencies are being managed in either spreadsheets or Microsoft Word or a departmental database, and not in the integrated system. Well, it's only in the next 12 months I think you're going to start to see competencies and courses establishing parity. And that's a critical step where the competencies are represented as full-fledged citizens within the data community. And we're going to start to see that, and that's a critical and essential next step. The other area that we think is a major challenge relates to student records. Historically, the students' records have been bound into a proprietary data form within the student information system. Periodically, it pops itself out in the form of a paper or a PDF transcript or possibly an XML file. Well, that needs to change, and there's many, many reasons for that, not the least of which is the increasing degree of demand for less than degree achievements, recognition of incremental stackable credentials that can be able to support learners as they look for work, either on a full-time or a part-time basis. So we think that the pressure on institutions to support their students in the employment market is going to go a long way towards moving the student records out of the lockbox and into a standardized form to contain both individual and bundled units of learning. So individual courses, individual competencies, or certifications, and bundled up to and including the degree level in a standardized data form that can be secured and shareable and controllable by the learner. We see this happening. Next slide, please. Especially in the area of digital credentials. You know, Jeff, you mentioned the stalling of the open badge progress, and we couldn't agree more. Our members have identified this as a significant concern, and they're focusing in on why that is happening. And we think that the very general nature of the open badge specification is actually both a strength and a weakness. And IMS is working towards creating a more refined version of that open badge spec, leveraging an extension capability that digital badges allows. We're working with the Badge Alliance, and we'll be helping to define a classification of badge for education institutions that will speak more directly to the employment community, especially in the area of rigor, assessments, evidence. And we believe that through the use of IMS's compliance certification process, where IMS certifies a platform as being compliant to a standard, that we will start to see much more in the way of portability of open badges. I think, Jeff, you commented about LinkedIn, possibly Facebook. You know, LinkedIn, the badges that are present there are not readily portable into and out of. The vision of the open badge specification is learner control of their achievement certifications and records. And so in order to have that, these badges must be portable. In order to have portability, you need to have compliance to a particular technical standard. So all this comes together in what we believe will be a comprehensive learner record, a digital representation of the learner's academic achievements, social achievements, etc., in a form that is going to be much closer to the open badge, much closer to the e-transcript prototypes that IMS has been working on, and will allow the learner to control their educational assets in a way that's going to benefit them in the future.
Thank you, Mark. It's fascinating stuff. A lot of the hard work to make all of this happen is through the interoperability standards and getting agreement across vendors and institutions, and there's been a lot of great work done there. I wanted to go back to a topic that both Jeff and Tanya touched on, which is Jeff talked about the maturity of analytics and course design and CBE, and Tanya is leading this National Research Center work. So I'm curious from both of you, how do you get the insights of learning science into the classroom, into the course room? What do you see being the catalyst there to make that really happen at scale?
This is Jeff. I think that there's a couple of things that become important in that conversation. Number one, I think we have to start looking to places we've not looked historically or traditionally. I appreciate that there are finally some really nice books and journal articles and even popular articles that start to explain some of these sorts of things in ways that make it easy for a layman to understand. And you know, I would also add that in all of the work over the years that I've done, I'll stick with neuroscience specifically, since that's been one that's been so difficult to bring into the classroom for so long. You know, if you get 3 neuroscientists in a room, I don't think you'll ever get all 3 of them to agree on almost anything. But there are a few very, very big topics and concepts that they seem to all, that you can, generally speaking, get, you know, 75 or 80% of them to say, yeah, that seems about right. And we're also starting to understand how those things can then be taken and implemented in a more pragmatic way. So I think that the first step in getting some of that done inside the classroom is looking outside of the classroom. You know, it's attributed to Einstein, although I don't know it's true. The old quote that says, you can't fix the problems with the same people who created them in the first place. And while these aren't necessarily problems, it's definitely never been part of the culture to, you know, look to brain science, to look to data science when it comes to interjecting stuff into the classroom. And I think we have to have conversations with those people and start to include them. I'll end with this, then I'll let Tanya speak. I had a conversation once with John Medina, the writer of Brain Rules, who I respect very much, and he made a really profound observation. He said, you know, I work at a university, and my building is not anywhere near the education building. I don't eat lunch with educators. I don't go to conferences with educators because I'm not invited and they're not invited to ours. He goes, why is that? And I think it's a really good question that we need to start asking and answering, not just about neuroscience, but about data, about different ways that other industries are using some of these things that really should make their way into our learning experiences.
Thanks, Jeff. One quick follow-up. One of the audience members asked, what are those things that the learning scientists agree on? And then we'll go over to Tanya.
I would encourage you to read Brain Rules. Medina tries to put the 10 things that he claims we know to be true about the brain, meaning they can be replicated anytime, anywhere. And he would say there's only 10 things right now. So I would check there first.
Okay, thanks. One of our other audience members, Tanya, pointed out that a lot of the topics don't require additional advances in technology. It's really about institutional change. So I'd ask if you could respond on that from that perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because a lot of us who have been teaching or teaching online for a long time, we have been sort of using our learner analytics. You know, some of the studies that come out are saying, like, well, the students, to be successful, they should log in before class starts. For students to be successful, we should have quote-unquote interventions. We should send them emails. And I mean, guess what? A lot of us really good faculty and instructors have been doing that for a long time without really elaborate, you know, technology platforms to tell us to email us students, or for students to be told to log in. So we've had some ways to already do that for a long time. I think what we run into when we talk about this moving forward is, first of all, do we have the right data? We're only really capturing a portion of the picture with the data that's available within our technology systems. There's so many variables and measures that we're not capturing. And so therefore, we also see that these equations and logarithms that are sort of kept under lock and key that we're not really sharing, you know, how do we know that they are valid and reliable in predicting success at all? And I think lots of those questions haven't been answered. What's the right data? How do we get additional data that's needed? How do we weed out data that we don't need? And how do we come together in some sort of consortium without trying to make money and develop a true logarithm for success? Because at the end of the day, we need to provide students and instructors with meaningful direction. And if we have partial data and partial equations and these sorts of things, I think a lot of faculty are going to be slow to adopt, because my methods of just, jumping in and seeing who logged and who didn't has been working for me for the last 15 years. So for us to pay hundreds of thousands of years as an institution or as a system for some new technology that's going to just lead all students to be successful, I think a lot of us are really hesitant to commit that. And I just don't think we're there yet in the data infrastructure and identifying the data that's meaningful, or in identifying the influence of that data, what students and instructors should be doing.
Thanks, Tanya. I'd like to switch tracks a little bit. There are a couple of questions from the audience related to the credit hour and crosswalking courses, and I'll refer that to you, Mark. You've worked with a lot of institutions and institutional representatives that are working on CBE, and you talked about the maturing of the Edtech tools on the market. So where do you see that going in terms of the variety of barriers for CBE and what we should expect over the next year or two?
Well, I'm not a policy expert, but I do understand that when we talk about crosswalking of courses and competencies, that's frowned upon in terms of the development of the curriculum. That the concept is primarily focused on obviously what the learner knows and can demonstrate, but at some level, a relationship between course delivery and the competencies that are made up within that unit of time or place are critical. So, the vendors will need to incorporate a course competency relationship. What we've identified in the research with CBEN is that relationship has to be a many-to-many relationship. That programs often will have multiple courses that relate to multiple competencies, and many-to-many. And so the vendors that certainly have worked with us on the prototypes that were developed last year, they're all very aware of this, and most vendors understand it. And it's a complex database challenge, but not unheard of.
Thanks, Mark. Any other comments from Jeff or Tanya about CBE and what you expect to see in the next few years?
Yeah, I think that we're, there's going to be a lot of looking around to see what clever solutions other people come up with. As I mentioned, not all accreditors have treated this equally. The Department of Ed, has made some promises and guarantees that so far people haven't just taken them up on it, or they haven't been made available in the way that people thought. So I think there's going to be a lot of looking around at first. It reminds me quite a great deal about online learning way back when it started in terms of a grassroots feel. But I think it will pick up momentum very quickly because, again, a huge number of people have really put a lot of effort into this for the last 18 months, and we'll start to actually be able to see a tangible product from more and more institutions that will, possibly be a nice template for another institution to follow suit on.
I think what's really interesting is what CBE is going to do to the rest of higher ed. So having some experience in measurement consulting and adaptive testing way back, lots of fields are competency-based to begin with, and we see those fields, easily or more easily moving to CBE. But I'm very interested in how CBE has changed structures of time. It's made us document learning better. We are able to build more transparency in the black box. And I think it's very interesting to see how the CBE movement will bleed back into traditional distance education, online, blended, or just higher education in general. Because at the end of the day, we should have competencies pretty much for all learning that's taking place in higher ed. And I think it, increases some accountability. And so I think it's just really interesting. And even when thinking about what it's done to traditional universities like financial processes, registration and enrollment processes, it's really led to some transformation. And so I think we're going to see some of the CBE benefits really bleed into higher ed in general, in the next 5 or 10 years.
And Jeff, let me call out the CBEN website, cbenetwork.org, cbenetwork.org. And I'd encourage everyone interested in understanding best practices and emerging practices. That's a very good resource for you.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Tanya. We have a set of questions around e-portfolios, digital badges and when they'll be real and credible, and the digital credentials. And I see all of those overlapping, merging increasingly. I'm curious where the panel thinks that's going. I know Jeff said he predicted last year they'd have moved further this year, but where do you see it going 2016, 2017?
If you don't, go ahead, Jeff. Sorry.
No, that's all right. I did say that, and I wish I would have seen more movement with it. But I'll tell you this: we're betting enough on it here at St. Leo. We're really implementing a pretty significant e-portfolio / assessment, and those two things really, from my perspective, can't be divorced from one another. An e-portfolio assessment solution right into our holistic system that we're trying to build so that we can use it in the classrooms, we can use it for teachers as they develop their faculty portfolios, we can use it for students to market themselves in lieu of resumes perhaps, or at least in help of that. So we're really betting a lot on that concept.
Thanks, Jeff.
Excuse me, Nick.
Yeah, go ahead.
In response to the slowdown, that lull in the digital badging area, we're seeing a lot of really excellent programs being developed. But as I mentioned, the open badge standard is very general and supports many different types of badges. And our members have come together to form a working group called Open Badge Extensions for Education that will be defining certain practices about badges for education that can be reliably implemented across platforms, so that when you see a badge that is OBEE compliant, you will know how to interpret it as an employer, and that its meaning will have greater significance. So we're refining the specification by focusing on things that matter more to educators.
I'm just going to jump in here quick because I might be a little bit more pessimistic about this. I'm really all excited about e-portfolios, which is sort of a general term, but the whole idea of experiential-based assessment and students actually showing that they're able to do something and not that they just did well on a bunch of exams or that sort of thing. On the other end, I don't know if I'm on the badge and credentialing train yet. I think that it's going somewhere. I'm just not seeing as it's going to happen today or the next day, and I think that we have a little bit of a culture of resistance. And so, it has to have a value until a large number of employers or even faculty perceive that as having value. It won't move that way yet. And I know I'm against a lot of what's going on, but I'm just not on that train yet.
All right. Yeah, it's good to have a variety of voices. People are bringing different perspectives to the question.
Well, actually, Tanya, to your point, and the very reason that we've pulled together this working group is exactly that employers are left to determine on their own what this badge means. And so what we're working towards is a better way to communicate the intrinsic value of that badge through some simple but meaningful refinements to the open badge specification. So that's the problem that IMS is working to solve right now.
No, absolutely. And I think at the end of the day is this going to be reliable and valid? And so I just think there's so much more that needs to be done before we're actually going to see, a diffusion of this. But yeah, absolutely.
And to your point about some areas, some disciplines already being competency-based, it similarly is true that some areas have more supportive non-degree credentials than others, like IT is usually the example. So one topic we haven't really gotten into, though people brought it up earlier, is analytics. Jeff, you said that's an area that's getting mature, and I'd be interested in what St. Leo is doing. And Tanya and Mark, I know you're working on Caliper. So what comments do you have on the maturity of analytics and how institutions are using them?
Sure. Thanks, Nick. We're really trying to use, and I think it was Tanya who said, we're still trying to figure out what is the right way to predict some of these algorithms. What is the right way to the best way to monitor a trend? And that's definitely true, and will likely always be true. There'll always be tweaking going on. But I think we do have some understanding of what some of those sort of best practices are, or more effective practices anyway, that we can start to implement so that the data is meaningful. I can tell you, based on how much time a student spends in an online class, if they are likely going to persist or not. And I can tell you that usually within the first 8 to 10 days. If you measure the right stuff, if you get the right stuff, I think you can really start to use these analytics. Although, I'm also really keen to say we're not just trying to do the monitoring and trending and prediction. We're also trying to look at our courses, our delivery, our even some quality indicators to try to be preventative and use sort of a preventative medicine approach to try to make sure that the problems don't even arise in the first place. And we're trying to use data to see some of that stuff too, around the kinds of products that we build that make it hard for retention, persistence, matriculation, those kind of common issues. Trying to nip it in the bud before it happens is something we're also trying to get the data to do. So that's kind of the route that we're really going down right now at St. Leo.
Tanya, one of the questions was directed to you about metrics that you're seeing that are especially valuable for student success. Is that coming through in your research? Anything you can share there? Tanya?
Tanya, I think you might be on mute.
I was totally talking away and muted myself. So yeah, I guess the thing is I'm just not buying a lot of the research that's out there right now, and sometimes I don't think the research is new. We sort of have this amnesia. Chuck Zubin and Tony Picciano talk about this a lot for the last decades and decades of research. But of course, we know if students spend more time in a course that they're going to be more successful. And of course, we know if the student completes all the work that they're going to be successful. I do like what, Jeff was talking about, though, is identifying when the student all of a sudden falls off track and having some sort of automated way that would take some of the weight off the instructor to get them on track, intervention or whatever you want to call it. I think that's really exciting. I think the problem that we have right now, which is exciting as we talk about that we're in this research culture, is we really haven't been doing good, solid, rigorous research on teaching and learning with technology, on blended online or CBE, and we need a lot more resources to make that happen. Jeff talked about mindset. Rob Lear has a paper very similar to the mindset construct of that talks about experimentation and growth. There's so much out there that we haven't explored yet, and understanding what enhances student success and how is it different now than the previous research for the last 40, 50 years. So I think we have a lot to do, guys.
From the technology side, Jeff, you put the MuleSoft logo up, and Mark, you're working on the Caliper side. What are you seeing in terms of that infrastructure maturity?
Well, it's still early days. The Caliper standard has defined its initial metric profiles, which are focused on learner interaction with content predominantly. I see a wide range of potential applications for additional metric profiles. We spoke a little bit earlier about the ability to measure instructor and student interaction. There's any number of different touch points. Innovative schools are working on measuring other aspects of the student navigation of their web browser, etc. So we're in very early days of the application of the caliper architecture. The good news is that a large number of product vendors are moving towards caliper and have adopted it and already are compliant. And it's up to us to begin leveraging what will become I think, a river of analytics, and again, to finally allow us to move away from platform-specific analytics towards more of an enterprise view. But we're in early days, in my perspective, of seeing promising results in many cases, but still what I'd call advanced R&D, Nick.
Thanks, Mark. And Jeff, how are you using MuleSoft? Are you using it in that sense for enterprise analytics?
Yeah, but it's also, really we're really trying to use it as a hub for all major technological aspects of St. Leo, so that it's a little more expensive up front, I think, to make sure that whatever goes into MuleSoft and comes out of MuleSoft is secure, and sometimes that requires almost double programming, the API to go in, the API to come out. But it allows you then to do the gating inside of MuleSoft rather than having to, force that gate to be written between every other single piece of technology you have. So it not only allows for a lot more seamlessness for user experience as well as for things like a data warehouse, but it also gives you the ability then to potentially layer all of your technologies on top of one another and potentially create deeper experiences for the user so that they don't necessarily feel like they're in multiple systems but just a single system. And then, of course, the benefits of that from data are you can have an x-axis and a y-axis that have all the exact same variables, and you can literally correlate or contrast or compare any two variables that you want within your whole system. So that's really how we're trying to leverage it.
Interesting. Tanya, did I hear you? Oh, go ahead, Mark.
I was going to say there may be individuals that aren't aware of MuleSoft and other enterprise service buses. And fundamentally, its benefit is to allow an institution to integrate multiple points, as Jeff was just talking about, not a point-to-point integration, but more of what's referred to as a bus integration. But at the same time, the transfer of that data must be done using some type of an agreed-upon standard. And often these enterprise service buses will include the specification layer, such as LTI, such as caliper, to ensure that the information format is consistent across the bus.
I was just going to mention, that just got really technical, by the way, but I think for me, teaching for a long time and, again, being partial to the social, I think one of the challenges is, it's great that caliper standards that we'll be able to bring in, again, technology data, but there's data that needs to be captured far beyond, how often did they access the course site? How often did they access this content? What was the duration? There's a lot more to learning than just the artifacts that we're seeing in instructional technology platforms. And I know that we're trying to get that piece, but I don't think we can forget the other pieces that are there that we're not going to be able to measure by the digital artifacts that are in these platforms. And how do we fix that piece of the missing data? So that's just all I was going to say. Thanks, Nick.
Sure. We have another question from the audience about student alert systems to help motivate students. So this idea of the nudge to help keep the students moving forward. Have any of you seen success with that? Any comments on that technology? I'll take that as a no. That's not something being used by the three of you, otherwise, or all three of you are on mute. One of the two is true.
Nick, this is Megan. I'm going to jump in. We're at close to our finish time, so I just wanted to say there were some questions that we didn't get to, and I'll be sure to pass those questions along to our presenters, and we'll get you written responses along with a link to the archive. Here is the contact information for our wonderful speakers. You can follow them on Twitter, reach out to them via email, but I want to thank all of our presenters today. Nick did a wonderful job moderating and keeping track of the questions and comments that were coming in. Jeff, Tanya, and Mark, thank you so much for your time and preparation that went into preparing to do this webcast. Thank you to all of the participants. This was our first time using GoToWebinar, and I think it worked out pretty well. If you have any feedback for us, please email me at mraymond@wche.edu. I'd love to hear from you. Learn more and stay connected. We have a new website here at WCET. I invite you to visit our website and view our resources, information about membership if you're not a member, and save the dates for our terrific annual meeting, which will be in October this year in Minneapolis. The call for proposals will be going out middle to late February, so be sure to look for that. Our next event is June 8th through 9th in Salt Lake City, and it'll touch on many of these topics that we discussed today. It's titled 21st Century Credentials, Learners, Institutions, and the Workforce. And you can learn more about that on our event page at the WCET.WCHE website. Again, I'll be sending out the link to the archive, the PowerPoint slides, and responses to any questions we didn't get to. Thank you to our WCET supporting members and our annual sponsors that underwrite our events and programs. Again, thank you to everybody for participating today, and we'll see you on the next webcast.